When you think of the Super Nintendo, what's the first thing you think of? If you answered a Smith & Wesson, first of all, Mario's Missing was not that bad, but it's not really accurate either. There were only some first-person shooters on the SNES, and I've been sure to only include games today that aren't just light gun or on-rail shooters. You gotta be able to move and look at walls a bit like this, because at the end of the day guys, let's face it, before Doom or even Wolfenstein ever hit a console, the Super Nintendo had Faceball 2000. Well, actually, an Atari system did first, but I'll get to that in a second. Faceball 2000 is a pastel-coloured acid trip where you, a floating smiley face named Happy Face, wander a 3D maze shooting other emoji-esque orbs to death. It sounds daft, because it is, but underneath the candy coating is a direct descendant of MIDI Maze from 1987, one of the very first networked multiplayer FPS games. That original ran on Atari ST computers connected via MIDI cables, making Faceball 2000 an early console adaptation of an online first-person shooter in 1992, but obviously can't go online. The Super Nintendo port was developed by Xanth Software FX, a studio that's not only hard to say quite fast, but was co-founded by John Romero's ex-colleague Mark S. Goodman. The game runs in full 3D and even supports 2-player split screen, making it the first console FPS to do so. Faceball is actually generally just a monumentally important series as far as the FPS genre goes, but it's really never gets its due for what it's done. I mean, there were plans for the Game Boy version to have 16-player link mode, but it was canned before release, though some nutters did get it working. Weirdly though, that Game Boy version has strafing, but this one on the Super Nintendo doesn't. It does have regenerating health though, years before Call of Duty made it the thing in FPS games. Faceball 2000 is clunky, pretty ugly to look at, and mechanically basic, but it walked so other SNES FPS games could run. Just about, as you will see. If Wolfenstein is the godfather of console FPS, Faceball 2000 is the weird uncle who did a few too many drugs and has been altered forever as a result. Right, that's a raptor on Faceball. It's no Warpath on the PS1, but this is not a bad dinosaur game at all. And bizarrely ambitious? Why are so many of them so ambitious? Ocean's Jurassic Park is one of those SNES movie tie-ins where ambition wildly outstrips the hardware, and nobody asked them to do all that. Especially Ocean. What are you doing, Ocean? At first glance, you see, this is a perfectly harmless top-down adventure about Alan Grant jogging around the island collecting keycards like he's doing a very specific Tesco shop. But step indoors and the whole thing pivots into a full 3D first-person maze. He's got flat shaded corridors, smooth-ish turning, ambient humming, and raptors that appear about 3 frames before they bite your head off. These sections weren't an afterthought or a lazy bit of trend chasing though. Interestingly, this game doesn't just predate Doom on the Super Nintendo, it predates Doom in general. Ocean actually commissioned an entirely separate engine for these sections, reportedly developed by a small internal team who'd never built a 3D game before. The SNES and PC versions of this Jurassic Park game share the same basic idea, but the differences in execution are massive. The indoor shooter sections on PC are simply cleaner and more legible and more playable, whereas on Super Nintendo they are grainy, slow, and prone to frame rate dips that make raptors feel like they're teleporting. While the Super Nintendo version is technically interesting for trying to pull off real-time first-person corridors on console hardware, there's no real contest in which Jurassic Park game you should play. It's Warpath on the PS1. This is clunky, won't let you save, and is impossible without a map, but Jurassic Park on the Super Nintendo is also one of the boldest 3D experiments of all time, really. And I ain't lying. Alright, before you start, let me supply my own asterisk here. I know it's a bit of a tenuous one, but I want to put it in. Yoshi Safari is Nintendo's first crack at a first-person shooter, though they'd sooner swallow a Super Scope than admit it. Yes, it is technically on rails, and not an FPS in the absolute strictest sense, but you're not just a passenger, and that's why I've allowed it in. You hop over gaps, weave through obstacles, adjust your pace by how aggressively you shoot, and generally feel like you're doing more than watching a glorified theme park ride. For a Super Nintendo light gun game, it is pretty hands-on, also just let me have it. okay? But it was built for one reason. Nintendo desperately wanted the Super Scope to look like a proper accessory and not just a big tube, so EAD put together this Mode 7 shooter where Mario sits on Yoshi's back like Steven Seagal sits on his arse for the last 20 movies, blasting mechanical Koopas with a crosshair. It does get a bit repetitive, but it doesn't stick around for too long, and also the final boss is Bowser wearing his giant suit of armour, and you've got to shoot him a billion times. Mario should have done that the whole time. A couple of cool trivia bits. This right here is the first Western game where Peach is actually called Peach, and it's one of the only times the Koopalings canonically pilot mechs. That raises too many questions. It's probably the most constantly overlooked Mario game basically ever, and that's really a shame, as it's just fun to talk about. Nintendo, you have the mice controllers on the Switch too now. You don't need the big tube. That's all I'm saying. Just wanna make you think about it. MechWarrior on the Super Nintendo shouldn't work, and yet it does. Granted, in a charming, this act is a defiance of God kind of way, but still. Instead of handing you a cut-down arcade shooter, Beam Software ported over the spirit of the PC game into a bit of a Mode 7 star shooter. You've got a full cockpit view, heat management, slow stomping movement, radar sweeps, and the general vibe of being trapped inside a walking boiler. It takes place within the Battletech board game universe, which has a game just called Battletech now, but also we're still getting MechWarrior games. Unlike most 3D SNES experiments, this isn't just corridors or rails. You get proper freedom to turn, walk and upgrade your mechs before you take on contracts, which is neat. Missions actually encourage scouting rather than mindless shooting because your mech overheats faster than the Wolfman drinking a cup of tea in the Sahara. The problem is that the frame rate dips into PowerPoint slideshow territory whenever there are more than 2 enemies, buildings or explosions within a postcode of each other. Turning your mech too quickly causes the whole screen to smear like it's been rendered in treacle. Add in no strafing and it does become a bit of an ordeal to get through these days. A cool ordeal, but still. Interestingly, MechWarrior did get a sequel on the Super Nintendo, but MechWarrior 3050 returned things to a far less clunky isometric view that just feels so much more natural on the Super Nintendo. Better the wolf you know, and all that. The Super Nintendo port of Wolfenstein 3D is probably the worst way to experience the classic, but it's mental it even exists, really. Nintendo's early 90s content rules were ruthless, so Imagineer had to strip out almost everything recognisably Nazi. Imagine Schindler's List with just a balloon. No Hitler, no swastikas, no gore, no corpses, and the guard dogs were replaced with mutant rats who looked like they wandered in from Shadowrun. Yet despite all that, it still feels unmistakably like Wolfenstein. If you can see what's going on at all. This thing feels like it was made from the memory of the dogs who got cut from it. It's blurrier than a Dead Meat kill count released in 2025. The port was rebuilt from the ground up using a mix of PC and Jaguar design notes, and while the frame rate takes regular nosedives, the core experience survived. Basically, you've got tight corridor navigation, shooting dudes, and keys. It gets the job done, but again, it just isn't great to look at all. I need to look my not Nazis in the eyes when I compassionately euthanize them with theoretical bullets. Imagineer themselves admitted in interviews that they were constantly fighting Nintendo's approval team, having to redraw rooms, portrait sprites, even menu art multiple times before it passed certification. In Japan, they did restore the dogs because Nintendo of Japan didn't share Nintendo of America's hang-ups about canine violence, but the rest of the censorship stayed. It is compromised and sanitized, but still kinda interesting as a footnote in the console's history. Weirdly, this next game might actually be the better game on the Super Nintendo. Super 3D Noah's Ark is one of the strangest artifacts on the SNES, and that's saying something for a console with a game about Tim Allen fighting dinosaurs. It's an unlicensed Christian-themed reskin of Wolfenstein 3D built by Wisdom Tree after id Software allegedly handed them the engine out of sheer irritation with Nintendo's censorship rules. Whether that lore is fully true is debatable, but it's fun to imagine John Carmack printing off a bunch of code and angrily scrunching it up before throwing it at these devs just to get back at Nintendo. Super 3D Noah's Ark is a Doom-era FPS where Noah fires animal feed at animals until they fall asleep. When you run out of ammo, you then have to feed them by hand, but it just looks kind of like you're making obscene Italian gestures at goats. Because Nintendo wouldn't improve the game due to its religious nature, Wisdom Tree had to get clever. They designed a pass-through cartridge where you plug an official Super Nintendo game into this, then this into the console, piggybacking off the legit cartridge's CIC lockout chip. It's basically the 16-bit equivalent of climbing through your neighbour's window because you forgot your own keys and then nicking food from their fridge. The strangest part is that it runs surprisingly well enough, it's pretty okay. The colour palette is bright and the enemies have a consistency to their behaviour that almost feels like a proper video game. It's still Wolfenstein's bones underneath, sure, but wrapped in a Sunday school coat of paint that kind of makes it, I don't know, unique, more interesting to play than Wolfenstein on SNES maybe? Super 3D Noah's Ark is strange and overall not massively great, but it's got over 30 levels of first person feeling fun, but we wouldn't blame you for giving up the ghost before the end. I genuinely think that this game kind of gave me nightmares in my childhood. I just looked at this thing and felt weird. This one is the perfect example of a Super Nintendo game that fell through the cracks. Playing similarly to Battlezone with you hunting down flags across possibly haunted chess landscapes, Spectre launched in 1994, but very few folks ever talk about it. It saw a North American release only, with French and German versions via GameTech, and never landed in Japan. It isn't polished like the major games on the Super Nintendo, which you should kinda expect really for a genre they hadn't even begun to figure out on console yet. The visuals, objects and effects are ultra minimal. It was like another game should be laid over the top of it. But that sparseness worked in the game's favour to allow the devs to try other things. You see, what makes Spectre interesting is that you get full two-player modes. In multiplayer you can pick from Arena, Flag Rally, Base Raid or Allied Attack, which is as much variety as like Battlefield 6? Crazy stuff. But would I choose this nightmare over most modern shooters? Probably not. It's a cool novelty now and an interesting thing to look at as a building block for a genre on console, but I wouldn't want to play it. Spectre is somewhat forgotten, but deserves a look precisely because it offers genuine 3D-ish movement, free roaming-ish arenas, and multiplayer. No ish. On the SNES. By the time Doom landed on the SNES, most people expected a smoking crater where the cartridge slot used to be. Instead, Sculptured Software somehow shoved its notoriously stubborn code into a Super FX 2 powered cartridge and told it to behave. And they didn't even have the rainbow badge yet. Oh, and by Sculptured Software, I actually mean mostly just one dude called Randy Linden. Yes, this is a trimmed down, wobbly compromise. There are fewer levels, simplified layouts, missing textures, and a frame rate that occasionally wheezes like an 18-year-old pitbull trying to get to the top of the Burj Khalifa, but it is still, unmistakably, Doom. You run, you blast demons square in the face, you try to interact with every wall you see, all on a Super Nintendo. It should work, but it does, and that alone makes it one of the biggest technical stunts in video game history. The dev team basically rebuilt the entire rendering pipeline around the Super FX2 chip, redrew sprites to fit memory limits, and repaced enemy encounters so the hardware didn't collapse. Even the automap system was retooled to avoid screen tearing. The Super FX2 chip was acting basically as the game's life support machine, and you can tell, it really does feel like the game could die at any point. It's worth bearing in mind though that computers in 1995 were like 10 times more powerful than the Super Nintendo. It's messy and technically pretty fragile, but Doom on the Super Nintendo remains one of the most audacious things anyone ever forced a Super Nintendo to do. Basically at gunpoint too. And hey, the Bizarro World version of that iconic soundtrack is actually quite enjoyable. Right, let's tetz you over to the last game of today. Did that work? There. If you've not engaged with some kind of screen for 40 years, Akira is a cyberpunk story set in a rebuilt Neo-Tokyo, where two childhood friends get caught up in a government conspiracy surrounding secret experiments, child test subjects, and overwhelming psychic power. Its movie adaptation changed anime forever, so you know some boring contrarian on Letterboxd has given it like 3 stars. What you're seeing right now is camcorder footage from CES 1994 of the Akira game for the Genesis, which was also planned for the Super Nintendo. It was apparently also coming to Sega CD, Game Boy, and Game Gear. The only Super Nintendo specific screenshot we had for years came from an issue of Game Zone in which Tetsuo looks like he's taken a trip to Springfield. Around 5 years ago though, very incomplete builds for the Genesis game leaked online, in which you can see Tetsuo just absolutely vaporize a poor nurse. The project was structured as a multi-genre adaptation of the film, which had released 6 years prior. You'd have had side-scrolling brawling, top-down exploration, cinematics, and also those first-person sections. So, what happened? Trademark. According to an old interview, publishers THQ just kind of massively overestimated what the SNES was capable of, and then neglected the project as it went along, and just kind of faded into nothingness when the programmer left. THQ being a bit useless, inconceivable. Weirdly, considering it's such a massive cultural touchstone with DNA in basically everything, we've not had many Akira video games since. We did get completely separate versions for the Amiga and the Amiga CD32, but they were absolute arse. Apart from those, we've only had Akira Pinball on PS2. What a waste. I'm not saying I need an extraction shooter like Akira game, but imagine a disaster report game mixed with something like The Warriors. Would be pretty cool, right? And I hope you thought this was a pretty cool video. I'd love to do more videos like this where we look at like every specific game on a console. So if you want that, please do like and subscribe and comment, and it'll let us know that that's what you want. I've been Jimmy, been good to have you, and I'll catch you when I catch you with a net. I've got a big net. Run!